I used to work in a small nursing home. We offered our services mostly to people having dementia. Dementia, for the ones that don't know, is a brain disease in which the people gradually lose the ability to think or remember. In most cases, daily functioning is severely affected. Anyways, I had been working there for about 10 years, so I had enough experience with that kind of people. But one day, we had a new visitor. It was a man bringing in his mother, claiming that she suffered from dementia and needed help. At first, everything was normal. His mother, Meredith, was in the corner of the room looking utterly confused. Something not uncommon with people having this disease. After signing the paperwork, the son left. I took his mother and went to show her her room. She was walking nervously and fast, like she wanted to avoid someone. Upon reaching her room, she bolted in, closing the door behind her. "Meredith," I said, "open the door for me. Go away. I want some time alone." I didn't want to be intrusive to our new patient, so I thought that she'll get over it. But it was kind of weird. The way she behaved when her son left was bizarre. Bizarre for a person with dementia. I let it slide, though. The next day, we gathered all the patients in the common room, as always, where they all interacted in a way or another. Because, dementia. Meredith was there too. She sat at the small table with George, a very kind man. He was at the latest stages of dementia. It's very sad for you to know that the person standing in front of you will die in less than 3 months, and you can't do anything about it. Meredith sat there, directly staring at George. She mumbled something, but I didn't hear it. I was taking care of another patient at the time. But Meredith was in my field of view. Suddenly, Meredith jumped, like she was a young kid, full of energy and desire to run onto George, knocking him on the ground. He was lucky he didn't hit his head hard. She started growling, and crushing sounds were heard. Maria and I immediately rushed over to take Meredith off George. She resisted. She, an 85-plus-year-old woman suffering from dementia, she was resisting the strength of 2 middle-aged nurses. That was truly impossible. After a lot of pulling, we managed to take her off George. Maria escorted her to her room, while I raised George. Then I noticed what happened. His thick jacket and his shirt were ripped, and the small wooden cross he was wearing was chewed up. Somehow, Meredith knew there was a cross under his 2 layers of clothing. At that time, I started getting my doubts about her having dementia. The next day, we brought her to her room again and made her sit on a small table alone. George, of course, didn't remember yesterday's incident, so we wouldn't have tension between them. Meredith sat there with a blank stare. She was creepy, not gonna lie. But we ought to help her, I thought. Meredith then started looking around like a mad person. Her head was turning, like she'd seen a fly, and wanted to copy its movement. And then she just stopped. She was continuously staring at Elizabeth, and also a new patient there. She did that for 5 more minutes. And then she stood up. She threw the table to the side and started biting Elizabeth's hand viciously. Maria and I again rushed to get her. She managed to push Maria 5 meters back with her one hand. That was impossible. It was surreal. A dementia-suffering person did that. I was shocked. But Maria snapped me out of my trance, and we proceeded to push Meredith away. We did it, after some tries, but it was a bit late. Elizabeth's right wrist was chewed up to the bone. Meredith then spit something. It was Elizabeth's chaplet. She destroyed it. It had a small blue cross on it. The cross wasn't there anymore. Both Maria and I accompanied Meredith to her room. From that time on, we didn't let Meredith in the common room. We had realized at that point that Meredith's problem wasn't dementia. It was something else entirely. Mind you, I didn't believe in the supernatural back then, but I hadn't yet ruled it out of my mind. We contacted her son, David. At least we tried to. He wasn't answering. We tried multiple times, but the phone would only go to voicemail. We decided to take care of her as best as we could before David contacted us. 2 days later, it was time for Meredith's bath. We made her stand up, and we proceeded to go to the shower. We reached the doorway, but when we tried to come out of the room, Meredith held us back. Allison, another nurse, and I were trying to pull her towards the shower. She still resisted. After a couple of minutes, Allison, being a new nurse, quickly became impatient and pulled her with as much force as she could out of the room. She was successful, but before she could take another step, Meredith turned around, bit her arm. Allison fell back, started screaming in agony, while Meredith ran inside. Like she was a professional athlete, the wall was covered in Allison's blood. She quit the day after. We didn't allow Meredith out of her room after that incident. We didn't try to bathe her again. We tried giving her food and water, but she wouldn't chew or drink anything. 2 weeks had passed, and she hadn't eaten something or drank any water. She should have been dead, but there she was, looking alive. And I say that because I didn't think she was alive at all. This woman was clearly possessed by a demon, and David still didn't answer the phone. I decided to reach out to some priests. My boss said that I was overreacting. I told her to go inside the room herself. She did. The room was freezing cold, despite the heat being turned all the way up. "That's new," I said. My boss was skeptical about this ordeal. After a lot of persuasion, she said I could bring a priest in. As I turned to walk out the door, a picture fell off the wall. I put it back up. I hadn't even turned around by the time it fell off the wall again. The glass broke. I looked at Meredith. She was staring at me and smiling. Smiling at me with a creepy kind of smile. My boss told me to hang the picture back up, and that she would go get a broom. Told her it was no use, that the picture would still fall. She said, "Yeah, whatever," and proceeded to hang it herself. "See," she told me. Then the picture shot through the room and landed at the wall opposite of us. My boss ran outside terrified and told me very distinctly to immediately call the priest. The priest would come 5 days later. In the meantime, we weren't allowed to enter the room again. But I did decide to go in once. I sat beside Meredith. She started whispering. The conversation went like this. "How are you?" "Shh, my friend." "What about your friend?" "He's sleeping. You don't want to wake him up." "Oh, I'm sorry. So, what's your friend's name?" "I don't know." I tried to show some empathy to her. So I whispered, showed her affection, knowing that if she was indeed possessed, she wasn't having a great time at all. "Where's your friend? Can I meet him?" "Oh, Madison, do you believe in God?" Yeah, I do. What about it? Do you worship God? Yes, I do. Well, my friend isn't a friend of God's. That voice was not Meredith. At that time, she stared at me with that blank look she always had. I stepped back. I'm sorry, Maddie. I'm sorry that I wasn't a good father to you. But I promise I'd never forget you. And I tell you this, I love you, Maddie. I froze. This was what my father had said to me on his deathbed. How did she smiled. Creepily, of course. You all come up, Maddie. You need to leave. I started to feel a burning sensation on my back. I started yelling, while Meredith was laughing hysterically. I left the room and closed the door behind me. The burning stopped, but the pain was still there, and it was intense. I lifted my shirt and looked in the mirror. There were 3 long scratches, starting from my left shoulder, reaching all the way down my spine. I went to Maria. I told her what happened. She saw my scratches and rushed to get bandages. 5 minutes later, she came back. She was shocked. She said to me that the scratches were no longer there. I looked in the mirror. The scratches were gone. As sudden as they had appeared, they disappeared. 2 days later, the priest finally came. It was 2 men, an old and very experienced exorcist and a young priest. They went in the room. The old priest immediately froze. When we opened the door, Meredith's head turned very fast as she stared at the priest. She started showing her teeth and growling, like a dog would do if it felt threatened. The priest ordered us to leave the room. In the span of 2 hours, many voices were heard from the room, 2 of which had not belonged to Meredith or the 2 priests. After the exorcism, the father told us that she was a lost cause, and the only thing that could help her was a powerful ritual that needed to be conducted. That would most definitely disturb the other patients. It needed to happen daily for many weeks. It was impossible for her to come out of the room. They told us goodbye and just left. The young priest left with a blank look in his eyes. He was really terrified. I don't know what happened in that exorcism, and to be truly honest, I don't want to know. Meredith's room was closed 24/7. We would check on her sometimes to see if she was still responsive. We didn't want to potentially have a dead body just lying in her room. The monthly payment from David didn't happen. We contacted him again and again and again, straight to voicemail. As we learned later, apparently David committed suicide. In his note, he wrote that his mom was possessed, and he just could not take any more. He jumped off a building. 3 weeks later, I opened the door to check on Meredith. She was pale. She hadn't ate or drank anything for almost a month and a half, and she was still alive. By alive, I mean responsive. I personally don't consider her alive at all. She turned her head towards me. She then said in her normal voice, "I'm gonna meet Michael now. I'll tell him you're doing fine." She then turned her head and looked up. She passed away. It sent chills down my spine, because Michael was my father. After that, the room was empty, but you could tell that the evil was still there. I could feel it. The next patient that came, Charlotte, claimed that there was something in her room. We didn't do anything about it, and one day, I was next to her, At her bedside, feeding her, she grabbed my arm, looked at me with a terrifying look, and told me, "Meredith told me about this room. Why did you put me in here, Madison?" After that, she let go of my arm and stopped moving. The demon had taken 2 lives. My boss, after learning what had happened, chose to barricade the room. No one, under any circumstances, was allowed to step foot in there. The nursery home continued operating for another 12 years before shutting down. I left 8 years after the Meredith incident. That's at least what we called it. And we swore to each other not to talk about it again. Now I learned that someone had bought the patch of land. They want to demolish the nursing home and build something else. I don't know what it is, but I still wonder if that thing's still in there. And if it is, will it continue taking lives?